as Neil said, I have a connection to Calvary Chapel, Gulf Breeze, to Coastline. I was a skateboarder, and I even saw some ramps still in the parking lot, but this church has always done missions trips, and they would do skateboarding events in Ensenada, and I came to hang out with some of the skateboarders from this church when I was 15 years old. And the parent of one of them said, hey, if you ever want to, you can come work for me. He was a construction contractor. And so when I was 17, I moved to Gulf Breeze proper and lived here for 6 months, came to this church, and still have many friends in the Gulf Breeze, Pensacola area. And so walking through those doors, being in that lobby, for me was a blast from the past. And I'm just so honored to be with you. And before we study through Daniel chapter 6, as Neil said, I am overseeing now the Latin America operations for a ministry called Far Reaching Ministries. And I know Wes Bentley has been here many times. He's very close to Pastor John. But just very briefly, what Far Reaching Ministries does is that we, 25 years ago, started training pastors in Sudan because there was a civil war where the Muslim North was doing raids into the Christian South. They were stealing children and forcing them to be soldiers. And so we began to equip and train the pastors to also be chaplains and protect their local villages. That evolved to where now we've trained over 700 chaplains. We have 400 active chaplains. They're trained with Western-style tactics, and South Sudan is the second poorest country in the world. So we have the best soldiers in the country, and they're also pastors, and it's a very intense ministry. So with that, we were able to branch out about 10 years ago and started something that we call Ghost Operations. And Ghost Operations is the invisible hand of the Western church training and funding pastors in the underground church in the Middle East. And so we've been doing that when Afghanistan fell about a little over 2 years ago. We had 22 pastors there in Afghanistan. And if you know anything about Islam, for a Muslim, and this is across the board, the worst sin or crime, because for them they're synonymous, a human can commit is to abandon their Muslim faith for any other faith. And so a Christian pastor would be seen as the perpetrator of the worst possible offense within the Muslim worldview. And this isn't across the board in all Muslim countries, but when you have a country where a government like the Taliban or Hezbollah or Hamas takes over, if they are to find a Christian pastor, they will kill them, they'll kill their spouse, they'll kill their parents, and they'll kill their children to make an example out of them to the community. And so when the United States pulled out of Afghanistan and the Taliban took over, we had 22 pastors there. And so between the pastors and their families, we had 200 people in Afghanistan that we knew were going to die for their faith. And so we started a rescue operation to where we flew into a neighboring country, had all of our people meet us in the city. We hiked over the mountains, and we were able to remove all 200 people from the country to save them from what would have ultimately happened to them. To this day, we are continuing to rescue. We've rescued over 2,000 people total. And just about a month ago, my boss, the leader of our ministry, Wes Bentley, got a call and said, hey, we feel like one of our safe homes has been compromised. It used to be that we were able to pull out a lot of people. Now it's very arduous. It's very difficult to get countries to receive the refugees. And so we have safe homes around the country. And they said, we feel like one of the safe homes has been compromised. And Wes said, hey, let's not take any risk. Evacuate everybody from that safe home and take them to another safe home. And that night, the Taliban raided that safe home. And so it's just the nature of our ministry. We have a very, very intense ministry. We're involved in 6 war zones. We're in Sudan. We're in Afghanistan. We are in Ukraine. We are in Nigeria. We're in Myanmar. And so just like I said, it's not a lot of ministries that have this kind of bellicose feel to them, but God has called us into that. And so in Ukraine, we've been able to build 200 homes. We were feeding 15,000 people per month. We have 30 chaplains there. And so we have 2 homes with about 200 kids. We're starting a new home for kids that have been disabled. So just a ministry that is large, that is reaching a lot of countries. Whenever we talk about Ukraine recently, it's become very politicized. A lot of people are concerned about how much money has been sent over there. And we even asked things like, should we be involved in Ukraine with everything that's going on? Isn't their government corrupt? I'm Mexican, born and raised. I still live in Mexico. And sadly, Mexico is notorious for corruption within the government. And so as somebody who's been around corruption their whole life, I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that the government in Ukraine is corrupt. But I've also heard that there's some corruption in the United States government. I might be wrong. Don't quote me on that. So we don't work through the government. We have pastors, and we're not a humanitarian aid organization. We're a missions ministry where we're focused on church planting. And a little over a year ago, about a year and a half ago, we got a call from Joe Foch, who's in Calvary, Philadelphia, and he told us, we have a guy, a missionary from our church, who is, we don't disclose the country, but he's in Central America, and he is alongside with the police doing raids, rescuing children that are being used by the cartel for sex trafficking and organ harvesting. But he's by himself, he doesn't have any money, he doesn't have any structure. Is this something that you're interested in taking on? And obviously, with that subject, there's some really intense things. I like to try not to be too intense, but this is pretty intense. We sent one of our board members who was in the intelligence service of this country for 25 years, has been on a million operatives like this. And so we sent him, and the problem is with the amount of corruption that there is with the police force, a lot of our raids are unsuccessful because they'll get tipped off. And this particular raid was unsuccessful in the sense that the criminals had left the house that we knew they were in, but they left behind the cadavers of 3 young children that they had removed their organs to sell. And we've seen so much death, and we've seen so much war. And it's hard for us to be startled, but that was startling even for our organization. And so when our board member got back, he said, this is something that we have to get involved, and not just get involved as a side thing. And so we have, for the past year and a half, been involved in the rescuing and the taking care of children that were used for sex trafficking and organ harvesting in Latin America. I was a pastor of Horizonte for 12 years. I've been close to us for 7 or 8 years. And he asked me to come oversee this work, as it's just a complicated ministry, and it's in Latin America where I've lived my whole life. English is my second language. And so we started by buying a home that had the capacity for 30 children. We were able last year to rescue 30 children and house them in this home and take it to capacity. We expanded the home to be able to house 45 children, and now we have 45 children. And by the end of the month, we will have been able to expand the home to 60 children. So for me, it is outstanding that within a year and a half of starting this ministry, 45 children that were living the most hellish and dark life that you can imagine are now being taken care of, are now being loved, are now being restored. And so that is phenomenal. And I'll end with this before we get into the text. And one thing we realize is that it's not enough just to rescue children. We have to reach the culture. Because sadly, if we only rescue children, the criminals will just go out and get another child. Because what happens is, in America, when you think of human trafficking, you think of a child that was abducted at a Walmart or a mall, and that their parents are frantically looking for them and putting signs all over town. But in these impoverished countries, they'll just go to the indigenous communities or the poor communities or the drug addict communities, and they will buy the children off of the parents. And so it is very easy for them to get more children. So we can't rescue so many that there's a void. We rescue one and they'll go get another one. So that seems hopeless. But what can we do? Well, you and I know that the power of change is in the power of the gospel. And that when the gospel is preached and when churches are planted, that changes cultures to its core. And so this is our Pinzer movement, our two-pronged offensive. On one end, we're rescuing children, and last year we started planting 6 churches in cartel-controlled territories in Latin America, understanding that this is part of the change that we want to see. Now, I was asked by Neil to teach through Daniel chapter 6, and I'm so happy because it fits perfectly with what we're doing as a ministry, and so we can have this synergy of teaching through the text and kind of learning what we're doing around the world as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read through the passage. It's lengthy. It's about 27 verses, I believe. 28 verses. So I'll read through the entire chapter, and then we'll pray, and then we'll consider some points from this story. It says, chapter 1, verse 1. Chapter 6, verse 1, Darius the Mede decided to divide the kingdom into 120 provinces. He appointed a high officer to rule each province. The king also chose Daniel and 2 others as administrators to supervise the high officers and protect the king's interest. Daniel soon proved himself to be more capable than all the other administrators and high officers. Because of Daniel's great ability, the king made plans to place him over the entire empire. Then the other administrators and high officers began searching for some fault in the way Daniel was handling the government affairs. But they couldn't find anything to criticize or condemn. He was faithful, always responsible, and completely trustworthy. So they concluded, our only chance of finding grounds for accusing Daniel will be in connection with the rules of his religion. So the administrators and high officers went to the king and said, long live King Darius. We are all in agreement, we administrators, officials, high officers, advisors, and governments, that the king should make a law that will strictly be enforced, give orders that for the next 30 days, any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. And now, your majesty, issue and sign this law so that it cannot be changed. An official law of the Medes and the Persians could not be revoked. So King Darius signed the law. But when Daniel learned that the law had been signed, he went home, knelt down as usual in his upstairs room, with its window open towards Jerusalem, and he prayed 3 times a day, just as he had always done, giving thanks to his God. Then the officials went together to Daniel's house and found him praying, asking for God's help. So they went straight to the king and reminded him about his law. Did you not sign a law for the next 30 days? Any person who prays to anyone, divine or human, except you, your majesty, will be thrown into the den of lions. Yes, the king replied. The decision stands. It is official law of the Medes and the Persians. They cannot be revoked. Then they told the king, that man Daniel, one of the captives from Judah, is ignoring you and your law. He still prays to his God 3 times a day. Hearing this, the king was deeply troubled. He tried to think of a way to save Daniel. He spent the rest of the day looking for a way to get Daniel out of this predicament. In the evening, when the men went together to the king and said, your majesty, you know that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no law the king signs can be changed. So at last, the king gave orders for Daniel to be arrested and thrown into the den of lions. The king said to him, may your God, whom you serve so faithfully, rescue you. A stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den. The king sealed the stone with his own royal seal and the seals of the nobles so that no one could rescue Daniel. Then the king returned to his palace and spent the night fasting. He refused his usual entertainment and could not sleep all night. Very early the next morning, the king got up, hurried out into the lion's den. When he got there, he called out in anguish, Daniel, servant of the living God, was your God, whom you serve so faithfully, able to rescue you from the lions? Daniel answered, long live the king. My God sent his angel to shut the lion's mouth so that they would not hurt me, for I have been found innocent in his sight. I have not wronged you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed and ordered that Daniel be lifted from the den. Not a scratch was found on him, for he had trusted in God. Then the king gave orders to arrest the men who had maliciously accused Daniel and had them thrown into the lion's den, along with their wives and children. And the lions leaped on them and tore them apart before they even hit the floor of the den. Then King Darius sent this message to the people of every race and nation and language throughout the world. Peace and prosperity to you. I decree that everyone throughout my kingdom should tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. He is the living God, and he will endure forever. His kingdom will not be destroyed, and his rule will never end. He rescues and saves his people. He performs miraculous signs and wonders in the heavens and on earth. He rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. So Daniel prospered during the reign of Darius, during the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Jesus, I pray that you would speak to us as we consider this text. And I would assume that the majority of people here are familiar with the story of Daniel in the lion's den. But many times the story we're most familiar with is a story that we gloss over because we are familiar with it. So I pray that you would speak new revelation to us this morning as we consider your word. In Jesus' name, amen. I've got 5 points for us this morning, but before getting into that, I just want to kind of continue the line of what's happening in history up to this point. Last week, you saw chapter 5, which was the closure of Babylon. And so in Samaria and kind of this part of the world, there's been heavy-hitting empires, if you will. The largest empire of ancient antiquity, other than Egypt, was the Assyrians. And they ruled this area for 1,000 years. But briefly, for 70 years, their competitors, the Babylonians, were able to conquer the Assyrians. And in so doing, they became the world power for those 70 years. And that's when they captured Jerusalem and took Daniel captive. And then 70 years after Babylon conquered Assyria, the Medes and the Persians conquered Babylon, becoming the largest empire in human history and one of the largest empires to this day. During the time of Cyrus the Great, Persia ruled from Turkey to Egypt to modern-day Afghanistan. The only empire in antiquity that even gets close is the Roman Empire, and the Roman Empire was never able to conquer the Persian Empire. So sometimes we read the biblical stories and we hear so many names, the Hittites, the Amalekites, the Moabites, the Philistines, and they all kind of blend together. When you read Persians, think about the biggest empire the world had ever seen. So big that they had 120 regions. And it says that Daniel was one of the top 3 rulers for the largest kingdom in the history of mankind to this point. I've got 5 points for us this morning. The first one is, life will be riddled with highs and lows. Daniel was born a free man in Judea, was conquered and became a slave in Babylon, grew in Babylon to become one of the wise men, and through the interpretation of dreams became the right-hand man to the person who was the most powerful person in the world at that time. And then last week, we saw that Daniel became forgotten. That nobody knew about Daniel, that he became an old man, and it wasn't until the writing on the wall where Daniel was needed to reinterpret this sign that Daniel once again gets called up to deliver a message to a king that will die that night. And then when Persia takes over, they see this old man who's full of wisdom, and they place him in the top 3 spot. This is so indicative of what it means to be a Christian. This is so indicative of what it means to be a human. There will be times of prosperity and there will be times of pain. There will be times where God elevates you and there will be times where you face difficulty. It is impossible to be a follower of God and not face hardships sooner or later. I grew up in the 90s, I guess 90s, early 2000s. And back then, the fad was to have, Bible verses and bumper stickers and magnets on fridges or embroidered on a pillow or printed on a mug. And, it was usually, I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me. But, there's a promise that isn't often remembered. Jesus said, in this world, you will have tribulation. That's a promise that I never saw printed on a mug, as you're pouring your morning cup of coffee. But as he was for Daniel, that's only half of the promise. In this world, you will have tribulations, but be of good cheer. I have overcome the world. And for Daniel, he was consistent in his relationship with God, whether he was top 3 or right-hand man or a slave or forgotten. For him, his identity was not where he was at politically. His identity was where he was at relationally with God. And you need to know this. There will be highs, there will be lows, but you will never be forgotten by God. You might be forgotten by man. You might be struggling. You might be in a low season right now. You might feel like your life has lost purpose and it's lost vision and it's lost direction. My friend, even if you're going through a time of tribulation, be of good cheer. God has overcome the world and he's walking with you. Point number 1, life will be riddled with highs and lows. Point number 2, whenever you grow, you will be opposed. So Daniel, all of a sudden, is this Hebrew ex-Babylonian politician that gets grafted into now the Persian politics, and he gets placed pretty much as high as you can go. And he's faithful in that area, so much so that when the people are jealous of him and oppose him and want to get rid of him, they're looking for any faulty dealings, for any shady transactions, for any dishonesty. And his haters could not find anything that they could pinpoint to Daniel, saying this is poor administration by him. This is dishonest behavior by him. I love that about Daniel. He's committed. He's a man of integrity. And even so, he had opposition. Why? Because whenever you grow, you will be opposed. And you need to know that sometimes the opposition you receive is not because you're doing things wrong, but precisely because you're doing things right. And sometimes you need to take encouragement because we believe falsely that if we do things right, that people will be on our side, that they will be encouraging, that they will be uplifting. Many times, it's quite the opposite. Many times, you can be a man or a woman of integrity. You can be honest in your dealings. God can prosper you at your job, your vocation. And instead of people being supportive, people will be in opposition to your growth. And it's confusing because you can look at your life and you can say, I'm being as blameless as I can be. I'm trying to do things right. Dear friend, sometimes opposition is a sign that you're doing things right and not a sign that you're doing things wrong. I know he's not a Christian, but Aristotle said, do you want to live a life where you're not criticized? He said, do nothing, say nothing, be no one. Because the second that you are somebody, that you do something, or you say something, there will be criticism. Opposition is often a sign of God's favor on your life. Once again, it's counterintuitive. We would think that a man that is used by God, his reputation would be intact. But the enemy knows that if he can't get you on your integrity, then he will go after your reputation. So point number one, life will be riddled with highs and lows. Point number two, whenever you grow, you will be opposed. Point number three, we ought to choose commitment over culture. This is probably the most clear teaching of this text. That there was a decree of the government saying you cannot pray. And what does Daniel do? He shuts up his windows, he closes the blinds, he prays in a quiet voice and makes sure that nobody can hear them. Is that what he does? He opens his windows. He prays towards Jerusalem. He does exactly what people are expecting him to do, and he knows that the result of obedience and commitment will be death. Imagine that. I mean, it's kind of hard to place ourselves in that situation, but imagine that if you were to pray publicly, you would be executed. How many of us would pray publicly? I pray that many of us would. But the reality is, there will be times where culture will oppose morality, it will oppose our Christian convictions, and we need to choose commitment over culture always. And I think that's the heart of this series. That's why the title of this series is Counterculture. And many times as Christians, we hope that the government will side with us. And we're hoping that laws and decrees will be favorable to Christians and church. But the reality is sometimes it won't. And the reality is, it seems that as time goes on, laws and the worldview of those in leadership goes further and further away from a biblical worldview. And the question is, what will we do? And the answer is, we ought to be like Daniel. Amen. Daniel didn't go and curse these people. Daniel didn't go and be angry at these people. But Daniel continued to do what he knew was right, whatever it would cost him. Daniel continued in his commitment even when the culture was opposed to him. I love church history, and there's a guy named Athanasius. And Athanasius was teaching about the Trinity in a time where there was a guy named Arian who became the most popular preacher, and most of the Christians around the world decided to abandon belief in the Trinity, and Athanasius kept teaching on the Trinity, so much so that he was banished from his pastoral position in Alexandria, Egypt 5 different times for preaching on the Trinity. And Athanasius had a nickname. In Latin, his nickname was Athanasius contra munda, which means Athanasius against the world. Isn't that a great nickname? There will come a time where, to be faithful, somebody might call you are against the world. Like in Acts, when they talked about the church, they said, those who have turned the world upside down have come here too. That's actually a compliment. I don't want to go with the flow. I don't want to be one more who just simply takes whatever the status quo is and adapts my life to that. I want to be like Daniel, a person of prayer, a person of commitment, a person who understands that regardless of the circumstances, I will be faithful to my God, whatever he asks me. So point number 1, life will be riddled with highs and lows. Point number 2, whenever you grow, you will be opposed. Point number 3, we need to choose commitment over whatever the culture tells us. I wrote this down. There will be times where honoring God will insult culture. And we must always choose to honor God, regardless of where culture stands. Point number 4, there will be hardship. I mean, Daniel, as we saw last week, was in his 80s. Imagine getting tossed into a lion's den in your 80s. Most children's art, pictures Daniel as this 18-year-old kid. He's over 80. He's been faithful to God his whole life. If anybody could say, why me? It would be Daniel. That's not his attitude at all. He goes in there. And it doesn't show up front that he knew he was going to get spared. He just knew that he was going to be faithful to whatever God called him to. There's a theologian who was killed by the Nazis because he opposed Nazi Germany. He actually was trying to get Hitler killed. His name was Dietrich Bon Hoffer. And from jail, he wrote this: when God calls a man, he bids him come and die. And for most of us in the West, Christianity has lost this element. But we work in places where this is true. We have 100 missionaries in Nigeria, and Nigeria is like Sudan was 30 years ago, where it's the Muslim north and the Christian south, and you have Christian missionaries going from the south to the Muslim north, and they're getting killed. Some of our missionaries aren't even lasting 3 weeks before they get killed. They know that going to North Nigeria is a death sentence. And the question is, why are they doing it then? And the answer is, how many Stephens do you need before you get a Paul? And there's people that are willing to do this. I was just talking with one of the pastors that we're about to support, who's an American missionary in a really gnarly part of Mexico. And they just killed a couple months ago 12 people 2 blocks away from his church. And he's got a 6-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old daughter. And I asked him, are you concerned for your personal safety? And he said, Jonathan, we've been so busy with the work that I just don't really have time to think about that. Now, here's the thing. For most Americans, being in that situation sounds foolish. But when did we lose this mentality as Christians, that when God calls a man, he bids him come and die? The church I had the privilege to pastor was large. We had 2 bands, and every year we'd do tours where the bands would play and I would preach. And on one of these tours, we got stood up by the cartel. We got passed by a pickup truck that blocked the freeway. There was a 45-passenger bus, a 15-passenger van, and a couple cars that were in our caravan. And 4 armed men with automatic weapons got out and pointed their weapons at us. And so we attempted to do a U-turn, which was a 2-lane highway with a bus, which turned into like a 15-point turn, trying to get out of there. And we're finally able to turn around and going back to the other city. And I decided to call my dad, that like Pastor John is just a legend within the Calvary Chapel movement. And I called him to tell him that we were going to cancel. And I should have known better because he's just old school and, So I told him, I said, Pops, we just got set up at gunpoint. It's really gnarly right now. We have a lot of people. I don't feel comfortable putting him at risk. And he said this: don't cancel. If you have to go by yourself, but don't cancel. Because Christians for the past 2,000 years have been putting themselves in harm's way because they believe in the power of the gospel. And if you cancel, you're telling this city that their city is too dangerous for Jesus to be preached in. If you have to go by yourself, go by yourself. You know, today's St. Patrick's Day. And I don't know if you know the story, but St. Patrick was from Britain, a Roman colony, and Irish pirates raided his town, stole him, and made him a slave. And in his early adulthood, he was able to flee and go back to Britain and then back to Europe for some time. And then God called him to go back to Ireland. That doesn't make sense. This is a place where he was a slave. And church history tells us that when he went back, he baptized 120,000 people and started 300 churches. And the question is, how many Stephens before we get a Paul? The question is, how many faithful people went to Ireland and died for their faith, trying to convert the pagans before we got to St. Patrick? We don't know. We don't know, and we celebrate the St. Paul's and we celebrate the St. Patrick's. But the reality is that there was precursors, that the only thing they did was sow a seed and die for their faith. And they heard, well done, good and faithful servant, enter into the joy of the Lord. Once again, this is pretty much forgotten in our culture. Our culture teaches us that Christianity can be hard, but it doesn't teach us that we ought to take up our cross and die. And sometimes that's literal. Sometimes that's not just, I really hate my job and I have a really hard time with my neighbors, but hey, that's my cross to bear. I mean, I don't want to minimize that because sometimes bad relationship with your neighbors or a tough job is difficult. But how many of us have said, hey, if it costs me my life, I'm going. If it costs me my safety, I'm going. And this is what I see in Daniel. To him, dying for prayer was a life worth living. And I wonder if we have forgotten that. Because once again, so much of our religious outlook revolves around us fleeing from pain as opposed to us embracing purpose. In the Gospel of John, Jesus said many times, my time has not just come. And one of the times he said, my time for glory has not yet come. Until the end when he's about to be crucified and he says, my time has come. Jesus, his time for glory was the cross. Amen. I find that fascinating. That for Jesus and his worldview, sacrifice and purpose go hand in hand. Death and glory go hand in hand. And point number 5, your sacrifice will bring life to others. I love this almost conversion moment in the life of Darius, where not only does he say, your God is the greatest, but he actually sends a letter out to the entire empire saying, worship the God of Daniel. Jesus said that unless a grain of seed falls into the ground and dies, it remains alone. But if it dies, it bears much fruit. Once again, this is part of our worldview that is largely forgotten. That sometimes being a Christian will cost everything, but fruit comes from it. When I was a pastor in Mexico, I had a guy come up to me asking for prayer, and he had a fresh bullet wound in his foot. And I was like, that's not normal. And he asked for prayer, and I said, yeah, I'd love to pray for you. What's wrong with your foot? And he said, I was one of the head hitmen, sicarios, for the most well-known Mexican criminal of all time. Don't need to say any names. And I worked for him for 20 years. And my wife and I became Christians, and we went to the boss and said, hey, we're Christians, we can't do this anymore. And because of my faithfulness to him for so long, he let me retire, which usually doesn't happen in the criminal world, especially when you know people, they keep you locked in for life. And so I was allowed to retire, and I was retired for 4 years. And then my former boss's son came and got me and said, hey, I need you to work for me. And I said, no, I can't do that. I'm a Christian. And he shot my foot. And he said, you got a week to change your mind, or I'm killing you and your entire family. And he went to ask for prayer, and I assumed that he would say something like, pray for wisdom to know what to do. But he said this, and it shook me. He said, can you please pray for me? Pray for courage that I might die well. Because he knew what awaited him. And for him, it wasn't a decision whether or not he was going to take the job. For him was the conviction that he and his family had weeks left to live, and he wanted to honor Jesus in his last weeks of life. And we forget that this is happening around the world, not just in Latin America, not just in Africa, in Asia, all over the place. For people, becoming a Christian means that their life is on the line. Their life is at risk. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. I want to show you a quick video. This is the home that we have for the kids that we've rescued. It gives you a really good visual of what we're doing, and then after the video, I'll come back to close. I know that watching that is an intense experience on one end, because it's beautiful seeing these kids playing and having a apparently normal childhood, but on the back end of that is knowing that these kids, what they've been through. And I get asked often about the blonde girl, and they'll ask me, is that a missionary's kid? Like, why is she so blonde? And the reality is that in this country, it's known for sex tourism, where foreigners come in, and her mother's a prostitute that was impregnated by either a European or an American. And we have 3 or 4 girls that are completely Caucasian looking because of their mother's profession. And these children often are the ones that are abused the worst because they're called premium kids. And it makes you think, who can do this? And how do we stop this? Once again, the power is in the gospel. The power is in being lights like Daniel was. Because this is what can transform a gospel, what can transform a people and a community. And I know this firsthand because of my family. My mother, her father, was a high-up drug dealer in a border town in Mexico. They were multimillionaires. And my grandfather was killed. And my mom's family had to flee. And if you know anything about psychology, people tend to fall in love with people that share the same character flaws as their parents. And if you're the daughter of a criminal, you'll probably fall in love with a criminal. And so statistically, the probabilities that my mom would have married a drug dealer and that I would have been born into this culture were very high. But my mom became a Christian. And she married a Christian missionary and pastor. And so my life is absolutely different because somebody shared their faith with my mother. My family, my children's family, because somebody shared their faith with my mother. Once again, culture changes through the preaching of God's word. And the reason why we see change, it's from the ground up. It's people realizing how sacred life is, how important another human being is. And it's not until people are confronted by God's love and Jesus' sacrifice that there can be that true change. So I have 3 areas where you can be involved. We raise funds for our ministry is through sponsorships. And so the first one I want to make you aware of is we have 2 homes with 100 kids each in Ukraine, and about 20% of the kids there have been trafficked, and we have a team right there, right now, that we're looking to take what we've learned in Latin America about rescuing children from human trafficking and use it on the front lines, because a lot of the children who lost their parents are now being trafficked both by Ukrainians and by Russians. And so we're looking to rescue these children and start a home there. The home you saw on screens is fully funded, but we're looking to continue to rescue more children now in Ukraine as well. We also have the chaplains and the pastors in Ukraine. Each of these, the sponsorship is $75 a month. Obviously, it takes a lot more than that to run these operations or to sponsor these pastors. So we have to raise several sponsorships per each. So the commitment that we ask from you is $75 a month. And then we have the pastors in the underground church in Latin America. And these are starting churches in some of the most violent criminal-run areas in Mexico specifically. And so any of these is $75 a month For some of you, that might be a stretch, and this is what we say wherever we go. Do not take money that you're currently giving to your church to give to our ministry. I know how compelling this is, especially seeing the children. You say, I want to do something. And you say, okay, so I'm giving this much money to the church currently, well, I'll just take from that money. What the Bible teaches is we give to our church first, and then we give to missions second. And for some of you, you might be on a very limited fixed income, and $75 a month might be out of your reach. For most people, $75 is doable. For some people, $75 is very easy, and you'd want to do a pastor in Ukraine and a pastor in Mexico, or a pastor in Ukraine and a kid. It all depends what God is calling you to do, but I think it is important for us to make clear that you need to be faithful and consistent to your local church, and if you choose to sponsor one of our missionaries or one of our children, to do it above and beyond that. We have code names for everything we do, and the code name for the home that you saw is Little Starfish, and it's based out of a story that a storm blew a ton of starfish out into the sand, tens of thousands of them, and a kid goes out to throw them back in the water knowing that if he doesn't, they're gonna die. And there's so many of them that somebody yells at him and says, hey, what are you doing? There's too many of them. You're wasting your time. What you're doing doesn't matter. And as he throws one in, he says, it mattered to that one. We ought to do for one what we wish we could do for all, and in so doing, we will change the world.